2022 and the music industry is dominated by electronic music and electronic drums. The Billboard and Rolling Stone charts spend an hour listening to any of the top songs here, and you'll find that most of this music was created without ever using an acoustic drum set.
Spearheaded by the Hollywood Drum Company in 1968, the electronic drum industry has revolutionized the way drummers create music and practice the instrument. For drummers living in small apartments and quiet neighborhoods, electronic drums offer the tools they needed to continue pushing forward and developing their skills.
Quiet home practice, training tools, thousands of drum sounds, and near-perfect studio recording are just a few things that electronic drums offered to make their mark on drummers around the world and found their way into thousands of homes and recording studios. But it didn't happen all at once. In fact, it took nearly half a century.
Electronic drums have a rich history that's lasted more than 50 years. So we've gathered 14 of the most innovative electronic drum kits to learn more about how they are made, how they work, and most importantly, how they sound. Join us on a trip through history to discover how each electronic drum kit helped us get one step closer to where we are today. From the late 1800s to the mid-1960s, inventors around the world were creating some of the earliest electroacoustic and electronic instruments. Early instruments like the theremin, the trautonium, and the rhythmicon set the stage for technological advancements in the mid-20th century. From the 30s to the 60s, we started to see electronic stringed instruments like the Rickenbacker frying pan and the Gibson Les Paul. This was an incredibly innovative period of time that ultimately led to the birth of the very first electroacoustic drum set in the late 1960s. Our story begins here with the Italian drum company, Hollywood Meazzi.
In 1968, the Hollywood Meazzi Drum Company released their very first line of electroacoustic drums under the name Tronicdrum. The company advertised the Tronicdrum series as the most significant advance in drum making in modern times. The wonders of electronics combined with a set of supremely balanced and engineered drums open up new and exciting opportunities for the drummer. In the US, these kits sold for $1,300 from Carl Fisher Music, which is equivalent to about $9,700 today.
Hollywood Meazzi released two different models of Tronicdrum kits. The Tronicdrum President, which has a module mounted over top of the bass drum, and the Tronicdrum Golden, which had a small module built into the bass drum itself.
The drum hardware was also very well made on the Tronicdrum kits. Apart from the hi-hat stand, you can see that this entire drum set is mounted on wheels, which made it super easy to roll on and off stages at the beginning or end of performances.
All right, so let's get inside the drums and see how these pickups work. So you can see inside the bass drum here, there's actually a pickup on the batter head. Works much like a microphone. Snare drum has one as well, but it also has a microphone that points downward against the bottom head, and that creates this really cool sound. If you look at the module, it's really, really simple. We have bass and toms set up on one section, so these three instruments all work together. We have the snare drum, its trigger sound by itself. Now when it comes to sound effects, well, this is really, really simple. This is a passive unit. It has no power. This is the only electronic kit in this documentary that has no electricity. So if we add the snare drum into this, but check it out when I add that bottom snare sound effect microphone. But still sounds just like an acoustic drum set mic'd up, but there's no microphones. Really cool.
So the real innovation here is the fact that this was the first time that electronic components were added to an acoustic drum set. These drums weren't cheap, but they were the first of their kind, and they really set the pace for other electronic drum manufacturers in the 1970s.
After the Hollywood Tronic drum kit was released, inventors and musicians continued to innovate with electronics during the early 1970s. Graham Edge from the Moody Blues worked with Sussex University professor Brian Groves and created what was considered to be the first fully electronic drum that can be heard on the song Procession from 1971. It had a rubber control panel, touch-sensitive triggers, and wires leading to hundreds of transistors. In the United States, Steve Launay built the Impact percussion synthesizer, and the German band Kraftwerk was building their own electronic drum kit prototypes to be used on their albums like Autobahn.
It was also during the 1970s when bands like Rush, Pink Floyd, and The Who began heavily incorporating synthesizers into their music. Records like A Farewell to Kings, The Dark Side of the Moon, and Who's Next all feature popular synthesizers of the era like the Moog and the ARP Odyssey. With all of these new digital sounds appearing on hit records, inventors were now trying to find new ways to innovate and even apply modular synthesis principles to the drums. It was in 1977 when drummer Joe Pollard and synth builder Mark Barton would release a set of electronic drums that would impact the entire music industry, especially in the world of rock and roll.
In 1977, Joe Pollard and Mark Barton released the first commercially available electronic drums in the United States, the Syndrums. The product was initially released as the Model 477 Pollard Syndrums, referring to the number of drums, which was 4, and the year of release, which was 1977. It had 4 separate drums and then 1 module. In 1977, the product sold for $2,000 US, which is equivalent to about $9,150 today. In 1978, Pollard's company, Pollard Industries, updated the Model 477 and released it as the 478 Syndrum Quad with an updated module and a foot switch. They also released their 278 model called the Twin, which was a 2-pad version of the already popular Quad. And soon after that, their 178 model, which was a single pad version.
So this all started with Joe Pollard, a drummer who was part of the legendary group of top LA session players known as the Wrecking Crew. And eventually he landed touring gigs with the Grassroots and the Beach Boys. In 1975, Joe spent more than $10,000, equivalent to about $50,000 today, searching for someone who could build him a set of electronic drums. Long story short, he found Mark Barton at the Tycho Brahe Sound Company in California, a PA company that did sound for bands like Black Sabbath and the Rolling Stones. Barton had built modular synthesizers in the past, so he was the perfect guy for the job. When asked about the design of the Syndrums, Barton explains that he was given 4 shallow 8-inch fiberglass drums to create the prototypes for Pollard. Pollard's main requirement was to strike the head and get tone. Barton chose the name and the logo, and Pollard designed the screw-together drum pads and hired Sam Mushnick from Duraline to make the Kevlar drum heads for each drum. Overall, the build quality was very sophisticated and even compared to Moog and ARP products. Before the official release, Pollard showed his Syndrum prototypes to other successful drummers in the industry like Jim Keltner, Ringo Starr, and Hal Blaine, all of which thought the idea was brilliant.
When the Syndrums were introduced in 1977, they were advertised as a new world of creative possibilities for drummers and percussionists, and they were a musical success. There were no preset sounds, but each channel gave the user a full range of tone, sustain, pitch bend, and noise controls. All right, let's get to know the Pollard 477 module and the Syndrum pads. The module itself is completely analog, so there's no digital components, there's no chips in this. It is as old school as it gets. Though it can sound like a drum, it can sound like just about anything you want, which is really something that was brand new for drummers. So let's see what it does. But I can play with all the settings. I can make that note really, really long. And of course I can change that sweep, that tone as it flows. And then of course you've got these other effects that are gonna make it sound like a much wider sounding note, like vibrato. And I can even change the type of tone that I'm using, going from a saw wave to a square wave. Now we actually have the Pollard foot pedal here as well, which actually has two functions to it. It's really, really cool. So all I have to do is turn on the pedal option here. If I press down on the little foot switch, I just get the basic attack of that sound. If I take my foot off the switch, I get that full sound. But I've also got an expression pedal, and it is pitch-based, so I can totally play with the pitch while playing the pad. You can make it sound like a drum, you can make it sound like something totally different, a whole new percussion instrument. And I think that was the real appeal to having something like this for all those big session drummers and why it became such a popular thing in the music they were making.
A-list players like Steve Gadd, Peter Erskine, and Jeff Porcaro loved the Syndrums and used them in many different live and studio settings. Despite the product being a huge success among drummers, unfortunately, the Syndrums were a financial failure for the business. Only about 600 units were sold in the first year, and by 1983, at the end of their production run, a single Syndrum was being sold at wholesale price for only $79 US, which is equal to just over $200 today. When we looked at the Hollywood Meazzi Tronicdrum series from the late 1960s, we were dealing with an electroacoustic drum set. The Syndrum allowed drummers, for the first time in history, to access 100% electronic sounds from the strike of a pad. This was revolutionary for studio recordings and overdubbing, but also for drummers who were playing acoustic drum kits and also needed to access electronic drum sounds at the same time.
As we move towards the end of the 1970s, there was another company that was making some headway in the electronic drum space. A company that was producing drum synthesizers. Their most popular products were very similar to Pollard's Syndrum products from the late 70s, but more intuitive and user-friendly. Let's take a closer look at the Synare by Star Instruments.
In 1978, Randy Hess, the marketing director for Star Instruments, wrote in Modern Drummer magazine, "Playing electronic percussion instruments is easier than you may think. You needn't have degrees in electrical engineering and acoustical physics to control a unit. In the studio, for recording purposes, is where they will really shine. No renting equipment, easy setup, and best of all, they can be patched directly into the line for recording. No mics. No taping heads or stuffing your drums to get a dead sound for recording. That tight sound is at the touch of a button."
Norm Milliard from Stafford Springs, Connecticut, founded Star Instruments in 1976. The company released their most popular product called the Synare 3, or the PS3, 3 years later in 1979. The Synare 3 was an 8-inch drum synthesizer controlled by striking a pressure-sensitive pad, like the Syndrums, instead of playing keys on a keyboard or synthesizer. This was very similar to the way the Pollard Syndrum operated. The Synare allowed users to use an oscillator to produce pulse and sawtooth waveforms, generate white noise, and generate other waveforms using a low-frequency oscillator. This was a popular product in the late 70s and early 80s and was used by musicians like David Robinson of The Cars, Alan Myers of Devo, Gary Newman, Herbie Hancock, and Lawrence Tolhurst of The Cure.
Back in 1979, the Synare 3 initially sold for $225 US, which would be about $800 today. The pad was designed to be mounted on a Ludwig tom stand, but it could also be mounted vertically like a bass drum and played with a bass drum pedal. This allowed drummers to use the drum in a few different ways depending on their musical situation. The Synare 3 was designed to be used in tandem with the Synare sequencer, which was released in 1978 and allowed users to run multiple pads at the same time, even though it could also be used as a standalone unit just like we have here.
You'll notice there's no power cable to plug in. That's because it's actually powered by two 9-volt batteries, and it only turns itself on when something is plugged into the audio jack. As we discussed, the Star Instruments product is much more user-friendly than the Pollard is. Now, it does have a lot of the same kind of functions and features. In fact, it actually triggers the same way. There's actually a speaker inside here, just like there is on the Syndrum pads. But this one, I don't have a bunch of faders. It's just a bunch of knobs, and it's really easy to use. Here's what it sounds like. Now, of course, I have tuning ability here. And I can adjust how much noise, or if I want a different sound, like a different tone. But a lot of times they were used to kind of bolster a snare sound. It's touch sensitive, and because it's battery powered, it's super portable, and you see a lot of really cool bands from that era using it.
Here we also have a more rare Synare Tympani from 1980. Drummers who used the Synare Tympani typically bought at least 2 units to replicate a traditional timpani setup. In a January 1985 Modern Drummer interview with Ian Wallace, he explained that with King Crimson, he even wired them together with Simmons pads that he was using, showing us yet another way that the Synare products were being used in real live playing situations.
They were sold in sets and with a foot pedal, but all that we have is this one pad. But it does work, and it sounds actually very much like a timpani. You can dial up tuning. You can change that pedal swoop. So there you go. As you can see, 2 very different sounds, very user-friendly, and really, really cool.
Like the Pollard Syndrums, the Synare 3 allowed users to shape sounds using parameters like decay, tune, sensitivity, and sweep. The function was very similar to the Pollard Syndrum, but the design of the snare was much more refined and user-friendly for drummers who weren't as familiar with the in-depth synthesis process. Having everything contained in one single unit was a huge advantage for drummers using Synare products compared to other drum synthesizers from the 1970s.
During the late 70s and early 80s, new wave and synth pop were dominated by drum machines and synthesizers and were forces to be reckoned with. This was the sound of modern music, and drummers needed a way to recreate these digital program sounds from behind their kits. Music was no longer just consumed by listening. It was now a visual form of media and entertainment, which meant that electronic drum kits would have to look the part.